today we are going to be looking a little bit at some of the basics of Buddhism and kind of what those beliefs of Buddhists are, talking a little bit about kind of what makes this religion a little bit different from some of the other religions that we're going to talk about in this class. So I know we've already kind of looked at Siddhartha, but I want to give you a brief overview of the founding one more time. So Buddhism is currently the fourth largest religion in the world. It's much newer than Hinduism. So if you remember, Hinduism was developed somewhere between 3,000 to 6,000 years ago. We don't know exactly. Buddhism was developed sometime between 500 and 400 BC. We don't know exact dates, but those are our best guesstimates. And the nation in which Hinduism was, or Buddhism was founded, is in the country of modern-day Nepal. So if you kind of look here, Nepal borders the nations of China and India. That's actually pretty important for modern-day history of Buddhism, so just kind of keep that in mind. And it was founded by a prince named Siddhartha Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama was prophesied when mother was pregnant with him, that he was either going to be a mighty leader, military leader, king, or a mighty religious leader. And his father, not wanting this to, wanting his son to become the heir, decided that he was going to lock him up and keep him hidden inside the palace. So Siddhartha grew up living this fabulous life. He got all of the goods he wanted. He married one of his cousins, and they had this beautiful family, and life was great. But Siddhartha felt like he was missing, right? Missing something. And so he sneaks out of the palace 4 different times, and the first 3 trips, he sees 3 things he's never seen before. First was an old man. His father had made sure to never have him around old age. The second time he goes out, he sees a sick man. He had never seen illness before. And then the last time he went out, he saw a dead man. He had never seen death before. And these 3 things shook him to the core. Then the 4th time he went out, he saw what is known as an ascetic, a priest. And basically he decides that he wants to find this way of living. How can I find peace in this world? And how can I overcome all of this suffering that I've seen? So he goes out into the woods, and for 7 years, he basically meditates. He becomes an ascetic himself. And eventually he realizes that he's lived these 2 different lifestyles, right? This life of luxury in the palace and this life of self-denial. And he realizes that neither one of those things is the right way to live. And this is when he becomes what we call the Buddha. Now, the Buddha is just a title that is given to Siddhartha. It's not his name, right? And what Buddha means is awakened or enlightened one. And according to Buddhism, there have been Buddhas before him and there will be Buddhas after him. But he is kind of the main one, right? And basically, what he realized is that he had to find what was called the middle way. And he basically thought that there were 4 noble truths, 4 things that were always going to be true of humanity. The first is that all life is suffering. Everybody's going to suffer in their life. You cannot get away from it, right? Then you got to come up with what's the cause of it. Well, the cause of suffering is desire. The desire to need something or want something. Even things like, you might get married and have a family and you desire this person, and that may seem great, except one day that person's going to die, or you might get a divorce. That's still the cause of suffering. Even if there was good things in there, there may not always be, right? So what he said, it's a very logical conclusion. If you're going to end your suffering, you have to end desire. Now that's easier said than done, right? Okay, I'll just stop wanting stuff. I don't know about you, that's really hard, right? So what he says is, in order to destroy your desire, you must follow the 8-fold path in the middle way, okay? So these are 2 different ideas, which we'll talk about kind of what they mean. So the middle way is basically you need to find balance in your life, right? Avoiding the two extremes. And if you think about the two extremes, they are the two extremes that Siddhartha put himself through. The self-mortification, the self-denial, starving yourself, not like being involved, and then self-indulgent passions, right? You got to find that middle road between too much and too little, right? So that's the middle way. And in order to obtain that, you have to follow the Eightfold Path. So these are 8 things that basically, if you are a Buddhist, you do these 8 things in order to try to find that end of desire yourself. So the Eightfold Path is right speech. So saying the right things, speaking the truth, not gossiping, not, talking bad about somebody. Right action, it's good behavior. Right livelihood, this deals with what you do for a living. So for example, Buddhists do not believe in killing animals. So if you are a butcher, that is not a right livelihood, right? So you find a job that allows you to not harm others. Next, we have right thought. So this is like thinking about things like love and nonviolence, selflessness, detachment from kind of the wants of the world, trying to rid yourself of wanting things and thinking about those things. Right understanding, seeing the way as they are, understanding the world as it is, basically understanding those Four Noble Truths. Right effort. So right effort is different from right action. So right action are the things that you do on a regular basis, but right effort is the actual active desire to promote good things and prevent evil in the world. So kind of think about like charity, those kind of things. Right mindfulness, this usually is just kind of being aware, being attentive to the things around you. Meditation is a huge part of Buddhism, and that's really where that comes in. And then last but not least is meditation itself, right concentration. And basically the idea is to achieve ultimate peace and tranquility. You are trying to rid yourself of all of these unwholesome thoughts and ideas and basically trying to say, I'm going to focus on that middle way. So these all seem pretty basic, right? Pretty straightforward. And you might be sitting here going, well, yeah, but that's easy. Like I can do that. But then again, that urge to gossip is always kind of there. That urge to say something about somebody or think like, I don't like that girl, right? So the Eightfold Path, while it seems simple, is actually really difficult to follow, right? So the ultimate goal of Buddhism is to achieve what's called Nirvana. So you may be familiar with Nirvana as a heavy metal band from the 90s. That is not what Nirvana is. Nirvana in many ways is very similar to moksha. So the meaning of Nirvana is to extinguish, okay? So basically what this means is you are trying to extinguish your desires, but also extinguish kind of all of the parts of the world, the things of the world, right? Achieve this perfect bliss. And that, to reach nirvana, is to reach the end of your reincarnation cycle, right? The idea is that to perfectly follow the Eightfold Path, to perfectly accomplish all of these things, it's going to take many lifetimes to do. For some people, it might take longer than others, right? And it's not the same as Hinduism where you kind of reincarnate up or down depending on how you live your life. It's just kind of saying, okay, we're just giving you more time to do this. But eventually, if you reincarnate enough and you have finally achieved bliss and achieved nirvana, your soul is extinguished, right? So it's kind of like this idea that accomplishing your desires, this achieving this perfect bliss is the ultimate end to suffering. Understanding brings this enlightenment. You might hear people say this as achieve enlightenment. That's kind of the same idea, the same thing. So that's really what people are talking about when they talk about reaching nirvana. So the goal is different from, again, when you think about like Christianity, the goal is to get to heaven. The goal in Buddhism is something called antamen, which means no self, right? Being a human, having a self, that is kind of what makes these desires happen. So you're trying to basically be beyond yourself. It's kind of confusing and it's a really strange topic to hone in on in a very short amount of time. So obviously, if we have time, we can discuss this more. But it's this idea that basically ridding your desires is ridding your self of everything, right? So there are also some things called the 5 precepts. So these are the 5 things as a Buddhist that you should never do. So you must refrain from harming living things, right? So this includes animals. You must refrain from theft, stealing something, that's not right action, from sexual misconduct, which can be interpreted lots of different ways. It might just mean like, don't cheat on your wife. More conservatives might take that as to like man, woman, marriage, whatever. Again, it really depends on who you are. Refrain from lying and gossiping. And lastly, from taking intoxicating substances. So no alcohol, no drugs, some Buddhists even no caffeine, right? So these are the 5 things that as a Buddhist you should not do, right? So when you think about the Eightfold Path, kind of think about like how this can manifest in your daily life, right? If you're a Buddhist, these are things that you do in a daily life. So think about, your home, your sports, your hobbies, all of kind of that. What are some different ways that you sort of see, how could I follow this path in my daily life? So that's something to just kind of think about here. Before we move on. So its relationship to Hinduism is really interesting. Sorry about that. So as you can see, or as I showed you before, Nepal is very close to India, right? In fact, in the ancient times, it was kind of a part of India. And so many of the same beliefs are shared in Hinduism as they are in Buddhism. So things like reincarnation, dharma, karma, so your actions, the good and bad things that you do, those are all very common. However, it also rejects many of the other things of Hinduism, such as gods and goddesses, but most importantly, the caste system. Buddhism says you don't have to be at the top of the caste to achieve enlightenment. Anybody can do it, right? Hinduism says you got to make your way through from, the lowest caste to the highest caste, and only certain people are going to gain enlightenment and achieve moksha. Buddhism says no, none of that, right? So you can kind of see how it would be really a comforting idea to lower caste Hindus to say that like, no, like as long as I achieve understanding, I can achieve that in my lifetime, right? Some Hindus also do see Siddhartha as an incarnation of the god Vishnu. So that's kind of how those religions sort of can work together. It is, like I said, a popular alternative for many lower caste Hindus because of some of the things that it rejects. Last but not least here, I want to talk a little bit about some of the texts that they have. So there are several different ones here. So I'm just going to kind of go through those really quickly. I'm not going to say them. I'm just going to go ahead and tell you that because I can't say at least some of them. So this first one is a collection of some of the oral teachings of Buddha, kind of some of his followers would write things down as he was teaching while he was alive. So these are kind of an important collection of that. Then there is the Tripitaka, which is a text that's translated into the 3 baskets of wisdom. These include lots of other teachings and philosophies. It's divided into 3 parts. And the reason it gets its name is because what would happen in this time period, they didn't have paper in ancient Nepal. So instead what they would do is they would write these things on these really big palm leaves and then put them in baskets to keep up with them, right? And so the 3 baskets are the discipline basket, which is kind of a rule book for how monks and nuns, so these are really intense followers of Buddhism, how they should behave. There are 227 rules for monks and even more for nuns because, of course, they're giving women more rules. The second is the teaching basket. And the teaching basket are some more of the actual teachings of Buddha, kind of about his life, about sort of the things that he believed. And then the last one, the higher doctrine basket, kind of goes into more detail, right? It's like an explanation of those teachings. Like, this is what we think of when we see these things. So it kind of is taking the teachings of Buddha and going a little deeper into them, but usually written by other people. There are also lots of other what are called sutras. So sutras just mean like writings. And there are other writings by lots of different holy people, especially depending on which branch of Buddhism you practice. There can be hundreds of these other sutras as well. So speaking of this, let's take a quick look at how Buddhism spread and the different divisions of Buddhism. So Buddhism, when it is in India in the 500s, it spreads out very quickly into the other parts of Asia. So you can see here it goes down into India, even into the southern parts of India, down into what is Sumatra and modern day Indonesia, up into Tibet, even all the way to Afghanistan, of course into China, and even as high north as Korea and Japan. And still to this day, Buddhism has a very strong influence in a lot of these other countries. One of the ways that it spread so quickly, especially in India, was because of this guy right here. His name is Ashoka Maurya. He was part of the Maurya dynasty. He was a group of leaders in India. And he ruled India from 273 BC to 232. So about 200, 300 years after the Buddha. So the Ashoka himself was this really intense warrior. I'm going to move myself over here so you can see the words. So he was a warrior, right? And he fought a lot of these battles all over India and Asia, and he kind of grew sick of them. And after the Battle of Kalinga, which had some pretty intense bloodshed, decided that, you know what, I'm not going to fight anymore. War is bad. Violence is bad. So he turns to a religion that promotes nonviolence, which is, of course, Buddhism. So he converts to Buddhism and then starts the spread of Buddhism throughout all of India. He builds what are called stupas. Stupas are kind of like temples, so you see them down here. They're not exactly temples, but they are places of remembrance. Sometimes they are built on top of holy sites. So, for example, the site where Siddhartha gained enlightenment, there is a stupa built there. He built monasteries. So monasteries are where the monks and nuns will go to learn and then to teach. And basically his goal was to create Buddhism as the main religion in India. Now, he does declare it the state religion, and many Indians do convert. However, it's hard to enforce that. Hinduism had such a strong hold that eventually it does kind of merge with Hinduism. So those connections we talked about earlier, and it doesn't really take over in India. But it does spread throughout, as I said, throughout the rest of Asia, and really does take over in places like China, Korea, Japan, and even, like I said, Indonesia. But what he does do is he also sends monks out to other places to teach. And that's kind of how it spreads outward from India. So even though in India it doesn't take hold, the monks that he sends out to the rest of Asia does kind of grab hold onto Buddhism. Another way it spread is the Silk Road. So the Silk Road is a route that passed between the East and the West, right? So it started in Rome and went all the way to China. And this is a 4,000-mile route. Lots of traders go across this route, and lots of caravans are traveling across. Well, the Silk Road is really important because what it does is it links Asia with the western part of modern-day Europe. And in both directions, there are lots of ideas that flow through: political ideas, social ideas, artistic ideas, but important for us is religious ideas. So Buddhist monks would kind of situate along the Silk Road. They'd build these monasteries, and basically they helped spread the religion. They became missionaries of Buddhism all across Asia. And some of those ideas even did make it back to the West. So because of these monks along the Silk Road, and because people are traveling all up and down the road, it allows the religion to really spread. So you can kind of imagine, right? If somebody is here and they stay at a Buddhist monastery and then they go here, they're going to tell people about it. Right? So the Silk Road, because of its length and because of how many people are trading on it, really does help Buddhism spread. Now, as Buddhism spread, it changes, okay? So there are four main branches of Buddhism that we're going to look at. And the first is Theravada Buddhism. So Theravada Buddhism is one of the largest schools of Buddhism, one of the two largest. And Theravada means teaching of the elders, right? So the way you can remember this one is teaching. Theravada is teachings. So this one is the closest to what Siddhartha himself would have recognized as Buddhism. It sticks to the original teachings of Buddhism. It's mostly practiced in Southeast Asia, so places like Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Myanmar, Laos, Sri Lanka. And this is a very simpler form of Buddhism, right? It's very individual. Each person must find their own way, find their own path to enlightenment. It doesn't matter what your neighbor's doing. It matters about what you're doing. How are you focusing on the Eightfold Path? Most Theravada Buddhists do not see Buddha as any more than a man, really important man, but they don't worship him. They don't pray to him. They don't see him as a god. They just see him as the guy who taught them the way, right? A lot of Theravada Buddhists, they worship very simply. They choose to forego a lot of personal belongings. They live, like I said, very simple lives in order to try and reach Nirvana. Theravada Buddhism has a very strong monastic tradition. This is the one when you see kind of the stereotype of the monks living in a monastery on the top of a mountain that you must climb to find peace. That's probably Theravada Buddhism. Because again, if the way to achieve enlightenment is to spend all day meditating and thinking and, reflecting, it's a good way to do it, right? So this is, like I said, a very strong monastic tradition. A lot of times you're going to see the Buddha shown in that very ascetic way, very skinny, like skin and bones, kind of representing that time that he spent trying to figure out what Buddhism was all about. Right? Now you'll notice these robes here, these kind of orange colored robes. Every branch of Buddhism, monks wear a different colored robe. So this is the orange robes. So when you see orange, that's Theravada Buddhist. The second biggest one is something called Mahayana Buddhism. So Mahayana Buddhism is very different. It means the greater vehicle. And what this one says is there are lots of different ways to nirvana. They also believe in different spiritual planes, something very similar to heaven and hell and spirit worlds. They believe that this is also a religion that should be community, whereas Theravada was very individual. This one says, no, all people are related. We all need guidance. We all need help with each other. So this form of Buddhism is really about helping each other as a community form. This form of Buddhism is what is practiced mostly in Northern Asia, places like China, Japan, and Korea, Vietnam, even in parts of Eastern Russia. This is what that's going to be. So in this form of Buddhism, it's much more like what we would think of as a stereotypical religion, right? There's lots of rituals and practices. This is where Kung Fu comes from, and they see Buddha not necessarily as a god, but definitely as a higher power. They also worship what are called bodhisattvas. So bodhisattvas are compassionate. They're called compassionate beings. They're in many ways very similar to angels in Christian Islamic traditions. Basically, they are people who could have reached nirvana, but have chosen to put off enlightenment in order to help the rest of us. Right? So it's kind of this idea that they are compassionate beings in the sense that they're putting off their own bliss in order to help the rest of humanity. And some of these Mahayana Buddhists even worship Hindu gods. They see a lot of higher powers. They believe that Siddhartha was just one of many incarnations of a great spirit. Again, this one has a lot more rituals and sacrifices and a lot more practices to it. This particular one, you're going to see the yellow robes in that. These are some of the bodhisattvas that you'll see. So this is the main one, Buddha himself. But then these are all of the other bodhisattvas. This is one particular bodhisattva who is very important. She has lots of arms, you'll notice. So this is, again, the Mahayana Buddhism. The next one we have is Vajrayana Buddhism. This one is called Tibetan Buddhism. That's the way you should probably remember it. So Tibetan Buddhism, shocker, is practiced in Tibet. It is also the form of Buddhism that's practiced in modern-day Nepal, so in the birthplace of Siddhartha himself. So Vajrayana Buddhism provides a much quicker path to enlightenment. They believe that you can even gain enlightenment in just one, maybe even two lifetimes. So it's a much easier way. They also put a lot of emphasis on education. They want you to question, they want you to be skeptic, because the more you question, the more answers you can get, right? They do encourage a lot of rituals. There are a lot of chanting or tantra techniques. So these are like if you hear Buddhist monks saying what are called mantras, so like this very chanting sounding kind of thing, that's actually a form of meditation. They are very much practiced by Vajrayana Buddhists. They also give devotion to gurus, or what are known as lamas. Lamas are believed to be beings that are reincarnated, but they are kind of the ones that are the closest to the bodhisattvas, right? Like they're not quite there yet, but they're almost there, right? These are the guys who are just about to reach enlightenment. Now, their main guy is the Dalai Lama. So he is kind of the leader, and he is believed to actually be the incarnation of the bodhisattva of compassion. Remember the one with the lots of arms that I just showed you? That's her. Right? Now, again, I can't actually say her name because I can't pronounce it. But that's a very important incarnation. So he is actually, the Dalai Lama is believed to be the reincarnation of this bodhisattva, which puts him in a very high place in Buddhist society, especially for Tibetan Buddhists. Now, Tibetan Buddhists have also suffered quite a bit because when China took over Tibet in the 1950s, they made Tibetan Buddhism illegal. So there is a lot of issues. We'll go into a lot more of those issues as we get later on in the unit. Tibetan Buddhists you will often see in these red robes. This is a picture of the current Dalai Lama over here in the corner. Last but not least, we have the Zen Buddhist. So Zen Buddhism is almost not even a religion. Zen Buddhism, in many ways, is a way of living. They put a great emphasis on meditation, slowing down your life, right? So basically the opposite of how I'm talking right now. If you've ever heard somebody like, I'm totally Zen, man, think about what they meant. It's almost like, I'm very chill. Cool, I'm very slow, I'm very calm, right? That's where that idea comes from. So the emphasis here, for many Zen Buddhists, they don't actually even necessarily believe in supernatural beings. Many Zen Buddhists are not religious at all. They don't believe that the Buddha was any more than just a man. Some Zen Buddhists don't believe in Nirvana or reincarnation. What this really does is kind of a way of just saying, I need to focus on being a good person, to living a good life. It's very much of a nature-oriented religion, kind of like the idea that being in nature can help you meditate more. It's most common in Japan, but also in some parts of China. Zen monks wear this gray robe, very different from the rest of Buddhists. The idea is that the gray robe is kind of like blends in with nature. A lot of Zen Buddhist temples are in the middle of nature. And so the idea here is that you're really just focusing on your inward self, focusing on getting rid of those desires and kind of making yourself a better person through meditation. This is the form of Buddhism that is most commonly practiced in the United States as well. So that is kind of another big key for that. So this is just kind of a map of where Buddhism is practiced. It's the three main ones especially. Zen Buddhism is not on this map because it kind of overlaps with some of the others. But I hope that this gave you just a good overview of Buddhism and some of the important ideas and beliefs that come with that. Obviously, this was really fast. We will delve into a lot more of this later, but I just wanted to make sure you got that good overview. And so until I see you again, bye.